Welcome everyone, Questini here with a discussion about the races in Total War Warhammer 3 Thrones of Decay and how well they stack up right now compared to where they were before. I've talked about racial reworks in separate videos, but now I'm just going to give them rankings. Starting with the Empire. Previously, before Thrones of Decay, I would have said that the Empire is either a D or even F tier race. They just had so many problems. Imperial Authority was a fairly broken system that either pushed you to cheese the campaign. Specifically, one of the things you do in a Karl Franz or Gel campaign is you would take territory in Nuln, give it to Averheim, then get the event to get it back, to force them to give it back, and get them constant Imperial Authority. Marcus Wolfhard and Volkmar were not really in a better place either. They still aren't, they still have the same campaigns as before. However, Karl Franz is now basically the Empire version of Jan Bo. He gets a lot of these events over here, whereas Gelt, he's got a lot of magical potential and he has a pretty crazy campaign, which is all very nice and good, and I do certainly appreciate it in those campaigns. Furthermore, when we're talking about the Empire, there's other things to consider. The fact that you now have all hero recruitment at tier 2, so captains, witch hunters, warrior priests, and engineers, and capacity increases at tier 3 from barracks, gunnery school, Temple of Sigmar, as well as the foundry, does create a lot more possibilities in your campaign. Furthermore, the fact that you now have cannons at tier 3 as opposed to tier 4 opens up so many more possibilities in a campaign. Like, the Empire has a good artillery roster, but one of the reasons I never rated them highly from an artillery perspective simply comes down to the fact that the Empire, that just having artillery in your roster doesn't mean much if you genuinely can't access it, which was absolutely one of the principal problems in an Empire campaign. Just the lack of access, the lack of variety of units. If you're playing an Empire campaign before, one of the things you would do for the most part is you would be recruiting a ton of crossbowmen. But now, because of unit recruitment changes, so spearmen with shields being a tier 1 unit, great swords are no longer requiring an armory, handgunners being a tier 2 unit, cannons being tier 3, Knights of the Blazing Sun being available at tier 3 without a significant upkeep increase, Electrocount State Troopers being available at reasonable upkeep, and the ability of getting more of these units, especially in a Gelt or Elspeth campaign, because they can just get these units unlocked for research, does make these campaigns significantly better compared to where they were before. And that just overall makes for a much better experience in an Empire campaign. You're still dealing with the same threats: Vlad, Festus, Kazrak, Azak to a certain extent, Draika, but it is such a massive change from a campaign experience. On top of that, because of the new campaign mechanics for Karl Franz and Gelt, you just get an inherently superior experience compared to what you had before. So now, while I would say the Empire is not, strictly speaking, the very best race in the game, despite all these changes, they certainly feel as one of the most powerful races, one of the most powerful factions in the universe. That's what I would say is the case right now for the Empire compared to before. Whereas before they were one of the worst races in the game to actually play. Not necessarily worse from the roster perspective, there's still issues with that, but campaign mechanics perspective certainly limited them. Now I would dare say that the Empire, if I were to rank them, I would say the Empire is an A-tier faction or an A-tier race compared to where they were before. Why not S-tier? Well, ultimately, the reason I would say they're not an S-tier is I think S-tier factions, S-tier races need to be exceptional in terms of their strength. Now, the Empire does have a lot of variety with Karl Franz, Gelt, and Elspeth all playing in different ways, even if they're competing for the same territory. But they're just not quite on the same crazy level as, say, the Greenskins, Chaos Dwarfs, Dark Elves, and so on. There are some roster issues, specifically infantry issues, like, yeah, you can get great swords easier, but they still do leave quite a bit to be desired. Though you can get Karlberg greatswords far more often right now in a campaign, but again, just some limitations in respect to the infantry roster. Really good cavalry options, really good artillery options right now that we just didn't have before. So it's better, still need some work, I think, from like an infantry roster perspective, and they're just not as crazy as certain other races can be. Like, if I were to talk about S-tier races in terms of strength, Wood Elves, Warriors of Chaos, Chaos Dwarfs, Dark Elves, etc., those are S-tier races because they have so much strength and so few weaknesses, whereas Empire campaigns do tend to be pretty messy in quite a few ways, and there's still some limitations in that respect. Though those limitations more so are like just some of the limited options. The lack of infantry does hurt them in quite a few ways, I would say. But yeah, still a really good race, and certainly a significant upgrade in their campaigns. Though funny enough, I should mention this. One of the reasons I started covering Warhammer 3 as heavily as I did is I looked at the recommended campaigns for Immortal Empires and I laughed at the idea of Karl Franz being a recommended campaign. Would I say he's a recommended campaign right now? Probably not, though he's certainly in a much better state. But I would say this is a campaign you can really enjoy if you're an experienced player, whereas before it was a very miserable experience. And that's probably the conclusion with the Empire. They are so much more fun to play. It just, other races just have that extra edge. Don't get me wrong, great job. They're just missing that just extra edge that the Greenskins, for instance, have. Or even the Dwarves have. Then there is Nurgle. And I'm not specifically talking about Tamurkhan over here. There's a lot of things to discuss about him and where he lands on the ranking list. But for Nurgle as a race, well, let's just say that before 5.0, Nurgle was genuinely one of the worst, if not the single worst race in the entire game, alongside the Ogres, Tzeentch, specifically talking about Kairos and his campaign mechanics, but Creative Assembly have improved things. I do feel that they could have done more, and I do think that they are kind of married to the ideas, the original ideas that Nurgle had. And they have adapted them, they have improved them, but I think those ideas, the baseline notions behind Nurgle, just never were going to work that well in a Total War game, or a Total War Warhammer game. I think just the design of Nurgle was really bad. You had a very weak economy, very limited unit recruitment, extraordinarily high construction costs, and so on and so forth. And while things certainly are improved, I would say that there's still more to be done with respect to Nurgle. So, you no longer have to spend a mountain of money on structures. You either spend infections or you spend a normal amount of coin in order to get these structures. All well and good. But there's still problems. Hero capacity gets increased through garrison buildings. All well and good from that particular perspective, though it's a bit awkward wasting a building slot on something that just gives you hero capacity, because generally speaking with hero capacity, you get it from buildings that actually have some other useful effect. Improving the garrison, well, I think Creative Assembly was probably trying to respond to some criticism that Nurgle garrisons are too weak. So forcing you to build garrison buildings, if you want to increase your hero capacity, is probably a way to help people with that. I think that's the intent there. But here's the problem, or the problems. You still have very limited unit recruitment as Nurgle. Certainly not going to be able to keep up with many of the other races. Like, over here, I have a campaign where I've done quite a bit as Tamurkhan in 32 turns, and yet I'm only able to maintain 3 armies, or 4 armies, the one I just recruited, but 3 real armies. And these are not necessarily top-tier armies either that could necessarily justify the cost. It's not that they're extremely expensive, they are not, but the income of Nurgle, while certainly improved, there's still plenty of issues with respect to that. Where are those issues coming from? Well, the problem is, while Nurgle can now certainly generate significantly more money than before, like being able to get to 600 income from a tier 3 building, assuming you have 200 growth in a province, the issue is with regards to infections and also the plagues. Now, plagues are better, they're stronger, far stronger than they were before. You can spread them more easily, you can get more powerful effects, there's more variety. So that's all well and good. But the problem with Nurgle is that your infections, which are used to generate plagues and also improve plagues, are also it's also the resource that you're using to make military buildings. If you don't make military buildings, and if you don't use infections to spread to rush the cycle of these buildings, you're going to end up with limited troops, even if you can afford them. So in point of fact, in the Nurgle campaign, while you can get a lot of money in theory, in reality, you actually want to get a lot of these infection buildings to generate them per turn, because without that, you're just not going to generate plagues, you're not going to generate military buildings, and you're going to fall behind compared to many other races. And that is annoying. Now, keep in mind, this is still the development and progress version. This is not the full patch that's going to come out on release. So some things might be changed, or some tweaking that I would say would be required with that. Improved, to be certain, much more stable economy, much better situation, not quite the miserable experience that it was before. However, there is something else that I want to point out about this. Nurgle has unpleasant climate with mountains. Now, this wouldn't necessarily be a problem in theory. It is, however, very much in practice, because every Nurgle campaign, be it Kugath, Tamurkhan, or Epidemius, they start close to areas where there's a lot of mountains. It's better for Epidemius because he starts in the northern castways over there, though he got wiped out in this particular campaign by Daniel. We'll say what you will about that. But there's plenty of mountains in every Nurgle campaign to deal with. And because you still have fairly high construction costs, and you are going to have to choose between getting a bunch of infections, and you're not really generating a huge amount of infections from these buildings, but either getting infections to get unit recruitment in the first place, or getting income, it's not really a great trade-off. Like, you can consider cast dwarves. Like, cast dwarves may have limited money, but they generate a lot of materials and armaments, and they have a lot more choices. You can maintain a lot of armies with cast dwarves, and there is a balancing act that works well. But cast dwarves have every climate available in their campaign, and on top of that, they have multiple resources, whereas Nurgle just has cash and infections. Having to spend the same resource on plagues as you're doing on military buildings is not a great situation. I can understand trying to keep the cyclical nature of buildings, but there's another problem that gets created with that. Vassals. One of the main strengths that you actually have in a Nurgle campaign is the ability of vassalizing through diplomacy, because it can give you much better factions than you are as vassals. It's also, by the way, pretty crap in a Tamurkhan campaign, because your short campaign victory objective requires you to destroy Grimgor. And it's like, why the hell would I want to destroy Grimgor when I can make him my vassal and he'll do work? Like, look at this campaign. Holy crap. Like, I literally had to race Grimgor over here to the south to take some territory to sell to Kugath, because if I hadn't, in this campaign, what would have happened, he would have taken all of this. And now I declared war on Cathay. Guess who's going into Cathay in this particular campaign, gentlemen? But it's like, having Grimgor as a pet is all well and fine, but it's not really a strength necessarily with Nurgle. The power is there for vassalization, undeniably so, but the limitations on economy and the fact that you have to still play around with these resources and the climate situation do leave a lot to be desired. The new units are fine, but you do still want to own Champions of Chaos for this particular campaign. Like, I would genuinely say that Champions of Chaos is worth it far more if you're playing a Nurgle campaign than the actual Thrones of Decay DLC, which is a bit of a shame in terms of a campaign situation. It's mostly down to Chaos Warriors of Nurgle and Chosen of Nurgle. I mean, you can certainly handle a Nurgle campaign without it, but it's going to be a lot worse for it. So from that perspective, Nurgle does still leave a lot to be desired. Contradiction in victory objectives versus vassalization situation. The fact that each barracks requires 4 turns to build up, so it's slow and they will cost a good amount of infections to build up, like basic 200 infections from a simple military building, and a lot more for an advanced military building, 400, does leave a lot to be desired. And this brings up a point about Nurgle. Why would I want to play a dedicated Nurgle campaign when I could play a Festus campaign? See, here's the thing about Festus. You have the same resource, the infections. You may get less of them, but you don't have to use them for any building. So in reality, in a Festus campaign, you genuinely may end up being able to generate far more plagues in a campaign as Festus than you would in a campaign as Tamurkhan, Kugath, or Epidemius, which, yeah, that's a bit silly. But on top of that, you have a much better unit recruitment situation, you have a much better vassalization situation, you can get a lot of heroes, you have a lot more power in a campaign, and you have a better climate situation. This is the standard that I judge Chaos campaigns by. Is it better to play a Warriors of Chaos campaign versus a Nurgle campaign? And the simple answer is, yes, Tamurkhan's campaign is certainly unique, but Nurgle is still not the best race in the world. I kind of really wish he would be a Warriors of Chaos campaign, because I think if he was a Warriors of Chaos campaign, he would be far, far more interesting. Though then you would just steamroll the campaign map, and maybe that's the problem. Like, Warriors of Chaos have that issue, but Nurgle just goes too much in the opposite direction. For what it is worth in terms of a ranking, I would certainly say it is significantly improved, but I think Legend of Total War really hit the nail on the head when he did a video on this, just when he was reading the rework details. He basically said that there was going to be a B-tier faction after the rework, and I agree with him completely. It's certainly not an A-tier faction, it certainly doesn't compare to the Empire. So either a B-tier or even a C-tier with Nurgle, with Tamurkhan certainly being a B or A- campaign. I would probably still say a B, because there's a lot of annoyances that do happen in this campaign, even with just the chieftains alone. Like, just how long, like, it takes a long time to actually get these chieftains fully unlocked. Yeah, Dreadquakes and Hell Cannons and all that are pretty awesome, but all the same, like, I just feel like that I'm playing a lesser version of Chaos and a lesser version of Nurgle in an actual Nurgle campaign as opposed to Festus. It is a similar problem to, say, Valkia versus Skarbrand. Oh, I know I have opened the Pandora's box with that little comment, but it is how I feel about this. It certainly has moved from an F tier, one of the worst races in the entire game, to something like a B, so there is genuine improvement. You will not find Nurgle campaigns completely insufferable after a patch, but I do think Nurgle gets significantly overshadowed by much better races in the game that existed before the patch, and both the Empire and Dwarf rework. So, improvement in that respect, but still, I think they're too married to this idea of cyclical buildings, and I think the problem is that you have this very slow pace of doing anything in Nurgle campaign, getting buildings, getting growth, building your economy, vassalization. And that just doesn't work well in Warhammer 3. I'm not saying a long campaign is bad. You can have very fun long campaigns. Especially with this DLC, there are certainly some situations like that. But Nurgle is not. But it's not fun to have a long campaign where your hands are tied behind your back from the very beginning, and you have to spend like half your freaking campaign to unlock that, to just reach a position of strength that races like Greenskins, Chaos Dwarfs, Dark Elves, High Elves, even Empire, so on and so forth, have from the very beginning of the campaign. And the limited unit recruitment means actually less variety in your armies. You might have a lot more unit types in an army, but you won't be able to get the really awesome stuff as much as you'd want. And you'll have limited armies as well, so less campaign flexibility than you'd have before. That's why vassalization is so important, but you got a crappy situation of vassalization because of the building construction times and cost. It's not fun spending 200 or maybe 600 infections just to get 3 barracks to be able to vassalize Grimgor, for instance. Really pays off for you in the end, but just buying yourself a robot that does your campaign for you is not the most fun experience, I gotta say. And finally, there are the Dwarves. This is gonna be a very easy ranking to do. S tier. S tier plus. Genuinely the best race to play in the game at the moment. And I'm not saying that lightly. And anyone who's watched my content for any length of time knows how very critical I can be of a lot of things. But the Dwarves do have so many solutions to not just only their racial problems in 5.0, but also to issues intrinsic to the game. If there is a race that is Skaven-like in this DLC in the sense that they're far superior to the others, that's been the accusation made against Skaven in Warhammer 2, that they generally got more love in their DLCs than the races and lords that they were paired with, that race is the Dwarves. Because what Creative Assembly has done with them in Warhammer 3, hell, what they did with the Chaos Dwarves is exceptional. But I would certainly say the Dwarves are absolutely better in a lot of ways to play than even the Chaos Dwarves, which was one of my favorite races pre-patch. Mind you, I still like the Chaos Dwarves, but the Dwarves just go a bit further, not necessarily because of their economy or units or anything like that, though they certainly have plenty of that to go around, but rather because how their campaign mechanics make for a wonderful campaign experience. So first off, let's begin with a couple of things, and I'll actually start with the research tree. Now you have casualty replenishment plus 5%, which was one of the biggest problems that Dwarves did have pre-patch, because they really didn't have any way of improving casualty replenishment with the exception of the barley field, which is a growth building, not a casualty replenishment building. On top of that, lords and rune lords now have a skill that gives you 5% extra casualty replenishment. For rune lords, it's a choice. For lords, it is something you're certainly going to get. You will require rank 12 to do so, but it is certainly a nice benefit, and it actually makes dwarf lords better. Before, you basically always wanted to use rune lords, but now you have a reason to use regular dwarf lords. And with respect to dragon slayers, well, dragon slayers have one particular purpose: focus on slayers. So a slayer army is now far more viable with the rework in itself, let alone all the new slayer units. Furthermore, the growth situation has been drastically improved. Dwarves used to have one of the worst growth rates in the entire game. Maybe they shouldn't have used the growth system, maybe they could have switched to a material system like the Chaos Dwarves, but I think the way Creative Assembly handled it, well, maybe not my own personal preference. I admit I do have a very soft spot for the Troy economic system. I do think they did handle things in a much better way. Now you can get up to 50 growth in a major dwarf settlement and up to 30 growth in a minor dwarf settlement, which is pretty good. On top of that, you have incredible research that gives you construction time benefits, construction cost benefits, all around the board. So you can construct things faster, you can get population surplus with the Grand Throne Chamber when you capture new settlements. So whereas a faction like the Chaos Dwarves are Greenskins, Dark Elves, and so on and so forth, they're powerful because they can easily tear things down and rebuild them very cheaply. Dwarves are about taking territory at a high level and then building up even further once they have taken it over. Dwarves are not about sacking settlements, though even the income from sacking settlements has actually been improved in the Dwarf campaign, whereas previously they would get very little income from sacking settlements, and a pretty bad situation with post-battle loot. Furthermore, dwarves do now have, if I just auto-resolve this using mods, I probably would have to fight that battle manually. We now have a new post-battle loot option to get replenishment when fighting all factions. Drink to Victory has also been changed from a growth benefit to a control benefit, which we already had before, but a unit experience benefit, rather. So things end up being substantially better in a dwarf campaign. You get more experience for your units, you get better growth, and you get a better economy. While costs are still high for buildings in a dwarf campaign, your basic economic building can reduce construction costs in a province. This is something that Cathay has. Or you can choose to go for the Trader's Hall to generate oath gold, which can grant you the very powerful research that you have access to in the Forge. Now, the Forge has been nerfed, so the gray items effectively were removed, so you can't just abuse those continuously to craft infinite number of items. You'll have to pick and choose what you're going to go with what you're going to do with oath gold. But overall, it is a much better situation. I would recommend generally going for the oath gold building in provinces with 2 settlements, unless you really want to build up something very special in those settlements and you just want that extra bit of construction cost. Whereas with provinces with 3 or 4 settlements, yeah, you certainly want to go for Toolmaker's Workshop in a provincial capital for the Toolmaker's Guild Hall. So dwarves are in a much better situation from their economy perspective, growth perspective, even control perspective, because grudges were pretty awful and could affect your control, but now you can get a good amount of control. Their heroes have been improved, and their lords as well, as I already said. Another thing with dwarves is hero capacity. So like the Empire gets all their heroes from tier 2, so can you in a dwarven campaign, with the exception of the new Dragon Slayer. So the Empire still has a leg up a bit in that respect. Now, Dragon Slayers, you don't necessarily need a lot of them, but they do each of them give you replenishment. But because you can get 10% replenishment between research and lord skills, and because of Grumbrindle, who can give you 6% more through his special skill line over here and get up, you're going to be finding casualty replenishment. But you do have a casualty replenishment hero. If only Cathay had the casualty replenishment hero, that would be pretty sweet. But all the same, you do end up in a far better situation. Also, because now you have to choose between toolmakers and guild marketplace, you no longer have the situation where in every minor settlement, you basically wanted to build a toolmakers, a trading depot, and a drinking hall. Now you just basically build a toolmaker and a drinking hall, or a trading depot and a drinking hall. You generate a good amount of control through that. You generate trade resources. You're empowered the guild's commandment, which already generated extra trade resources, still is very powerful. But now you're in a situation where you have scalability of economy. You have a much better early game economy. You have a better mid game economy. You have a better late game economy. And you have better hero variety. All heroes, with the exception of the Dragon Slayer, can increase their capacity at tier 3. So, runesmiths, engineers, Thanes, all increase their capacity at tier 3. On top of that, there's been other changes as well. You can now recruit dwarf warriors from every settlement. You can recruit thunderers and iron drakes from tier 2, which makes things so much better in terms of the variety that you have in an actual dwarven campaign. So overall, you get more unit variety, you get more hero variety, you get more reasons to go for a lord variety in a campaign. But that alone is not why the dwarves are an S-tier faction, or an S-tier race. All of those things do help, but they would probably put them on par with the Empire. What makes the dwarves exceptional, and I don't use that word lightly, is the other things you have to worry about. See, most races, and I covered this in my Malakai video and my review video, most races, most lords in a campaign have 1 or 2 or maybe 3 things to worry about. Income, and that's obviously related to conquering territory. So basically just conquering territory and all that it entails, diplomacy, income, etc. And then some other unique things. All dwarven campaigns have 4 things to deal with. Other legendary lords, so you do care about the entire dwarven race when you're playing any of the dwarven campaigns, because you can confederate all of them from a distance. So how well those legendary lords do is actually going to be important in every single one of your campaigns. Furthermore, you then have legendary grudges, so that's the third thing, and then you have the Age of Reckoning. So all of these things combined make it so that not only do you have a great early game, but they also help make the mid and late game far more interesting, because they give you objectives to actually aim for and strive for, and because of the nature of dwarven campaigns where you care about all the dwarves as an entire race, you are incentivized to care about how they're all going to do. Like over here, for instance, the South and Karak-Azul were under a lot of trouble by the Skaven. So it creates far more interesting and dynamic campaigns than what we had before. A lot more variety in armies, a lot more variety in units. The Grudgeseller armies are great. The Grudgeseller units themselves give you the extra bit of variety in a campaign, especially early on, because you can get things like gyrocopters, which previously there was very little reason to recruit them. But not only have they been buffed, but because you can get gyrocopters with troll hammers, that is actually very useful. And very, very nice to have in that variety. So there's a lot of things to like about the dwarves. Their campaigns feel a blast to play, and right now I would dare say that they are the most interesting race to play in the game, flat out. Because even with races like the Greenskins, Dark Elves, Chaos Dwarfs, etc., you get kind of bored after like the first 30 turns. I've talked about this with other people as well that play the game, other content creators, and that's how a lot of us do feel, or quite a few of us do feel. But now, because of these dynamics of the race, it makes the mid and late game far more interesting. And I've spent about 130, 140 hours right now, certainly over 120 hours, playing in 5.0. And I have to say that out of all the races and out of all the lords that are affected by patch 5.0, the most fun I've had is with the dwarf. So S tier plus. Not only do they have a huge amount of power, though you could argue Warriors of Chaos, Orion, etc. are certainly more powerful, Even cast dwarves, though. Cast dwarves don't have thunder barges, they have dreadquakes. Well, I'll take your dreadquake with the thunder barge, no problem, Astrogoth. But beyond that, it's just such a joy to play, and it really shows what Creative Assembly can do when they care for it. Which, before the triple disaster of Pharaoh, Hyenas, and Shadows of Change, it did seem like they didn't care to. Their feet were put to the fire, so to speak, and they did have to do better. And they have. So, mission accomplished. Great job over here. To be clear, all of these races are much better to play. Empire certainly has moved up. Nurgle has moved up. And the Dwarves have gone from being one of the most boring races to play to one of the best races to play. From a campaign perspective, and even the variety in battles, because beforehand, the best thing you could do was recruit whatever heroes you could, quarrelers and grudge throwers, and then maybe replace those grudge throwers with cannons and organ guns. And that was basically every single one of your dwarf armies. Now, slayers work better because of the dragon slayers and demon slayers. Iron drakes work better because you can recruit them earlier. Thunderers work better because you can recruit them, and range units do seem to work better in the patch. So the dwarves are the clear winner over here, far above everyone else. Costine signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.